Thank you, and thanks committee, thank you Chairman for holding this inquiry, which we think is an important step along the way, I hope, to getting more action taken on this problem, which a lot of people have been complaining to Which and to other consumer organisations about for some time. We would define nuisance calls very simply as unwanted, persistent, unsolicited telephone calls for marketing purposes or texts. It's important. We've often used nuisance calls as shorthand for a part of a problem which is not confined solely to handset-to-handset calls. It's a problem of unsolicited text messages as well. And in our most recent market research on this, we found in May 85% of people had said they'd had an unsolicited call or text in the previous month. That's a pretty big proportion of the population, and that included people that had signed up to the telephone preference service and asked not to be contacted for marketing purposes. So in our view, and the reason we've been keen to see the committee look into this and keen to see the action taken by regulators and the government, is that this has become a growing problem. More people have come to Which complaining about this, and the significant proportion of people that have had this nuisance, either through phones or phone calls or texts, are now saying that they are afraid or do not want to answer the phone because they are fearful that it will be a marketing call, an unsolicited marketing call. And I think that's a significant problem for example, elderly people, vulnerable people at home during the day who are particularly likely to get that kind of call.
Claire?
Yes, thanks. Well, I agree pretty much with what Richard has said, but I would add to that, he said the calls are made for marketing purposes, and that, of course, is by a long way the bulk of the calls that are included as nuisance, but I wouldn't exclude a worse class of calls, which are basically scams and criminal. Of course, they have much more serious effects than bona fide marketing, which is merely a nuisance. They're small in number, but I do think we need to pay special attention to those, and I would include them in the classification of nuisance calls.
David?
The simple definition of nuisance is something that takes the time and attention of the person who's disturbed, where there is some element of impropriety on behalf of the caller. I think I'd use that sort of definition. We must go well beyond direct marketing. One of the major causes of silent calls is the use of automated dialers by debt collection agencies. That ain't marketing. It was that for that industry the restricted automated dialers were developed in the first place in the United States. And so that's something else we have to consider within the scope. It's not just about direct marketing. And indeed there are approaches that are made of all sorts, including by the collections industry, which are improper and are not and need to come within the scope of what's nuisance. The scale of the problem is such that I think the ambition of the direct marketing industry for telemarketing to represent what a former chairman of the telemarketing group called the welcome call is lost. I think any hope for us to see a telemarketing call as a welcome call in a general sense has gone. Whether that's the fault of those who are behaving honestly or not, I fear this is a lost cause. Not deservedly so necessarily, but I think we have to look at things now in that context, with the hope of maybe getting tighter regulation, getting the thing a bit better under control, can make people happy to receive marketing calls from companies they are pleased to hear from. I'm not sure that's ever going to happen, and that's something we must consider as we look to what needs to be done to move forward.
As three people who deal with the victims, if you like, of these nuisance calls on a regular basis, do you think that people are more aggrieved by receiving a call or a text message?
My personal view would be that the calls are the most egregious, and in particular that's partly to do with who's more likely to receive them. I mean, I completely accept the point of Claire and David that this isn't solely about marketing calls, but that is by far and away the bulk of the call, the unsolicited call that people are getting at home on their landline. It involves more nuisance. It involves very often people that are at home during the day, therefore a lot more likely to be elderly, as I said before. I think for the text message, it is a nuisance, but it's rather less intrusive than a call on your landline during the day.
And the particular industries, I mean, I think referenced in your evidence PPI, but can you give examples of other marketing agencies or industries that are using this kind of system?
Well, what's extraordinary, I mean, we found in our research that the majority of calls are done by firms, claims management companies, in particular on PPI, payment protection insurance claims, or personal injury claims. So that's the majority at the moment. But what's extraordinary is the range of reputable brands, often large businesses that are making unsolicited calls to people. For example, energy companies, and just recently we've seen two major energy companies, major energy suppliers, now commit to not doing this because they are aware of the reputation on the damage on to their reputation through doing so. So this isn't confined to any one sector. It's just at the moment claims management companies are particularly active in this area, and we found are generating the majority of calls right now. It'll move on somewhere else.
And those calls that are being received, are they always from a withheld number, or are they do they come up with an 0845 number or something? I mean, can you identify before you answer the phone?
It's a mix, and very often people have told us that there is no caller identification, but equally, in many cases, you can see it. I think the problem for most people is whether you can see the number or not. One, it's a nuisance anyway, and two, what you subsequently have to do to make a complaint about that call is too complicated, which I'm sure we'll move on to. There is a big problem of caller identification being withheld, but equally there are many companies that don't.
And Bradshaw. Simple question, but I haven't answered my telephone for years. I filter all my calls through an answering machine. Why can't people simply do that?
It's true. That's a very basic, I mean, with all due respect, Ben, that is a basic way of dealing with that. That said, on your if you're someone who's at home expecting a call, you will probably run and pick it up.
Why on earth? I don't understand why anyone would ever pick up the phone.
Well,
before hearing who it is through the answering machine.
Well, I agree. I mean, but again, we've had people come to Which and say, I've been waiting for a call from the hospital, an urgent call from a hospital to tell me what's happening to my elderly relative who's in care and in a serious situation. The last thing I want is to think I've got to wait and see whether the caller is legitimate or not to take that call. People are deterred. Their behaviour is not always to wait and screen through an answering machine. More people are buying equipment now to screen out calls. But again, why should the burden be on the customer, on the person at home? Very often, as I've said, the people who have come to us most aggrieved about this have been waiting for an urgent call. Why should they have to wait to see whether it's a claims management company trying to sell them PPI claims, or a hospital, or a relative, or someone from overseas?
Could I come in there? Because I think that's a very good question, because it illustrates the fact that we have a lot of different attitudes among us towards use of the phone. And you may be perfectly happy screening all your calls through an answering machine. I work from home, and I wouldn't be. As a freelance consultant, my leads come in through the phone, and so do
so
calls.
Your what comes in?
My leads, work leads. So I'm not going to put off somebody who might ask me to do an important piece of work by having them get anything other than a nice, friendly, personal reply from me. And obviously, you're entitled to do things your way. A lot of other people probably do, and I think a lot of people are, in fact, particularly young people, giving up fixed lines altogether, and they're not bothered at the moment by nuisance calls. But just wait, they're on their way to mobiles.
Could I just put the question back? Are you happy when you make calls to be answered by an answering machine?
Well, I was going
and
to
would you invariably leave a message?
I was going to come on to
If,
that.
if I would like to speak to you, I might find I need to answer the phone in person.
I don't mind speaking to the answer machine, but I was going to come on to the question. I'm sure colleagues will want to pursue this later. I regularly ring up my constituents. I cold call them all the time to ask if they've got any problems or concerns that I can help with, and they generally appreciate my calls. Can you give this committee an assurance that nothing that you would like to see happen would prevent me doing that?
Well, there's nothing I would want to see done that would stop genuine opted into direct marketing calls either. I mean, I think there is an issue.
But my constituents might not want direct marketing, but they might want me ringing up to see if they've got any problems that I can help them with.
Do you have their explicit consent?
Ring them. Because if you don't, technically, and one political party found this out to its cost some time ago, technically, your activity in seeking to support them as a political representative could be deemed to be promoting your political interests.
That's absurd. That's
and
an affront to
thereby
democracy.
could be deemed to be direct marketing.
But that's an affront to democracy. I'm their
It
representative.
is,
I'm there to help
potentially,
them.
yes.
I'm trying to help
Yes.
them. And you're saying you want to make it more difficult for me to help them.
So did Nick Clegg believe when he must called an awful lot of people to find out what was happening. But he got pulled out.
We've
because
got to
that
be
was
very
deemed to be
careful
direct
that what you
marketing.
want to happen does not stop me helping my constituents.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And I think there are other examples where, for example, legitimate market research, not done for marketing purposes, but legitimate market research, we wouldn't want to see that killed off by clumsy regulation either. I'm sure people are delighted to hear from you, Ben. I doubt there are many cases where people hang up or talk to you back in French or something.
Never. Almost never.
Yeah. But there is a very real and bulk of a problem here, which I think it is possible to define, and which I think it is possible to, with carefully crafted measures and use of existing regulation and regulatory action to deal with without harming your ability to communicate with your constituents, which is an
Of
important
course,
point.
the people who claims company would mount exactly the same defence.
I
But
think
you're
for the-
mounting, they're
for
trying
the
to help people.
purposes of this morning's session, calls from Ben Bradshaw outside the scheme.
So you may, John, just on this point, you may hear from Ben all the time in Exeter, and you may hear from some of us only at election time. But Ben raised a very valid point, because we increasingly do telephone canvassing, and again, it would be
GPS list was best.
again the implications of anything that would need to be considered very carefully.
Completely agree. And again, I think there are ways of carving out legitimate purposes, for example, for legitimate political campaigning purposes, for the vast majority of the complaints that we've been getting, though, that is not. I've never heard a complaint about your spam calls or texts or your unsolicited calls or texts. It's always been about claims management companies or large businesses. It's plainly about sales.
But presumably both you gentlemen would be concerned about the growing phenomenon of people withholding their phone numbers from telephone directories, which is one of the early reactions to being fed up with too many marketing calls. But we now have figures, I forget exactly what it is, something like 2/3 of residential numbers no longer appear in telephone directories. But we don't know exactly why, but this must surely be a big
That brings
part
it
of the
on,
reason.
because a lot of us probably don't list our numbers in telephone directories. I have received, probably 10 calls asking me whether I want to pursue a claim for mis-selling a PPI in the last, I suppose, 3 or 4 weeks. I'm no different to most of the population. How do they know my number? And particularly since I've never bought PPI, so it is not possible for me to make a claim even if I wanted to do so.
Well, I get them. I'm registered with the Telephone Preference
So am I.
Service, and I've been not responding to texts on PPI for years. But
are they
what's
randomly selected, or have they got my number as a potential claimant, or is it just they pluck the numbers out of the air?
It depends on the business, but what's behind this is the sale and trading of your personal data.
Exactly.
So when you're registering your data perhaps online with an insurance company, or you're entering into any legitimate transaction and unwittingly or otherwise in the past? You've given consent for your data to be passed on to trusted third parties or to others from whom you may have an interest in hearing. That has opened up the floodgates to your data, your personal data, being traded and passed on to firms that may be much less scrupulous about the use of your personal data than the firm or the organisation with which you originally did your business. And the big problem we have is that even when people have registered with the telephone preference service to opt out of receiving marketing calls, having given that consent earlier, there is a vagueness about the regulation of that is giving permission to companies to use that data in a way that you didn't agree to in the first place. And that's at the heart of what we think needs to be done about this. There's a huge and growing market in personal data.
Do you take a view, can I quickly ask, on the fact that it now appears that local authorities are happily selling off information from their electoral register? I mean, that seems to me to be another way that people are getting hold of numbers, even if you've gone ex-directory. I mean, do you have a view on that?
My understanding is that telephone numbers don't necessarily have to be on the electoral register. So for the purposes of deterring nuisance calls, I may be wrong, but that's what I think. You don't have to put your phone number into the electoral register. So that's about addresses and spam mail. I think any organisation, public or private, ought to be looking very hard at what it's doing to comply with the existing regulations on the use of personal data, and ensuring that if they're gathering your phone number for legitimate reasons, perhaps as a local authority where you're, buying parking permits or whatever, are we confident that every local authority isn't selling that data on? I haven't got that confidence at the moment, and again, this is the loophole behind this trade in data.
Colin, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back, if I may, to the question that Ben put to you, because I'm very interested to ask you how you ensure that in seeking legitimate regulation you don't actually choke off the relationship between legitimate people and their electorate. So, for example, when I was a candidate, I would very strictly adhere to the signs in people's front doors: no cold callers, no canvassing. I now, as a Member of Parliament, ignore those, because I think as a Member of Parliament I should have the right to knock on a door and say, I am your Member of Parliament, how are things? And no one who has had one of those signs up since I've been a Member of Parliament has objected to me knocking on the door. Likewise with Ben, no one has objected to me ringing up and saying, I'm your Member of Parliament, I'm just wondering, are there any issues? So there is a critical difference between elected Members of Parliament and councillors and political parties who already have to conform with TPS. How do you make sure that you don't actually get to the point where vexatious people accuse people like us of breaking rules that were there to intend to protect them from vexatious people, not from Members of Parliament?
I think what this needs to be about is a carefully focused attack on the problem as we've tried to define it, which is that this isn't about legitimate contact between elected representatives and their constituents. This is about firms often breaking the existing regulations for the purposes of sales calls or in the case of sales texts. And I think it would be really unfortunate and just wrong if there wasn't a carve-out for those legitimate purposes, because that wouldn't be attacking the problem. That's why at which we're not in favour of a complete ban on cold calling, because there are legitimate reasons for people to be contacted, for example, for market research or to hear from their MP. And I think we do need to be careful about ensuring that any measures that are applied to this are attacking the problem as people have complained to us about it, which is that it's unsolicited calls and texts for the purposes of marketing or indeed for fraud, but I think that's dealt with elsewhere.
Can I make the point, which is from the proposal that we put forward about the way to move forward on this, and this very much comes to the point you're making. The problem of using the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations as the sole means of dealing with this is that these are very general. These are very wide. These are based on certain generalised definitions of activity which require interpretation. They also require the use of the powers of the Information Commissioner's Office, which are not that great for all sorts of purposes, and they can't, for example, put anybody out of business with a penalty. So for that reason, they cannot be that severe. Also, the resources available to the Information Commissioner are not great. Furthermore, the Information Commissioner is not truly a regulator in the sense in which we now understand the word, because it is not truly engaged with those businesses who are conducting the activity that it's trying to control. Our proposal very much is that we recognise that what has been done by the Information Commissioner has not been able to be successful. It is a gross failure, we could say. And what we need to do at this time is turn attention to those who have the regulatory control over the particular industries who are conducting this nuisance in the areas where we feel it is not appropriate. There's a very great difference between, even though the way it looks in the PCR, it all comes under the same category, but there's a very great difference between what a Member of Parliament, or indeed a prospective candidate opposing them, may do in terms of contacting people, as against somebody who is trying to market the PPI service. Yes, both are trying to help, or so they would claim. But we need to look from a regulatory point of view at those two activities in a quite different way. Only the sectoral regulator, in the case of the claims management companies, this is under control of the Ministry of Justice, can take that view for their sector to say, is this a proper means of contacting people? Is it not? ICO can't make that determination, but the Ministry of Justice and the claims management regulators can make that determination. They, as a regulator, are in a much more powerful position to take action if they were to say, for example, no direct marketing to get leads for claims management. If that were to be their determination, they'd be in a much, much stronger position to enforce that. They could remove the licenses from people who were using leads generated in that way. And by that means, that would be a much more effective way of having a hope of getting on top of the problem. Whatever we may do about rules on consent, powers for the ICO, greater ability to impose penalties, smoother procedures, may well help, and I wouldn't be against them, but I don't see them having a dramatic effect on this major, major problem that's driving people to absolute despair.
And would your view be that that form of sectoral regulation would stop the increasing trend of some of these calls being generated from outside the jurisdiction of the UK?
The whole point is that this regulation would be over not necessarily the people making the calls, but the people using the information.
Okay.
With claims management, these are UK-based claims management companies, they have to be, but their leads are generated offshore. If we can say that leads generated by telemarketing are not an appropriate way of following our business, doesn't matter whether the calls are made, we've cut the thing off at the source. So there's no money in the system to make the people do this from overseas. We'll never get the people overseas. All we can hope to do to stop the overseas side of thing is cut off the money that's funding it.
Thank you. Angie Brain.
I'll put the question to all three of you. How well do you think that TPS is working in what is obviously an increasingly difficult set of circumstances? Richard, do you want to start?
I'm afraid it's not doing the job it's designed to do, and there are two main reasons.
Is that because it's just simply too big, really, now?
I'm sorry?
Is that simply because it's really too big?
I think it's because, for two main reasons. One is that people, I think, and they've told us at which this in very large numbers, assume that registering with the TPS isn't going to deal with the problem. And we've always advised people do it. It may not cut the problem off completely. It may reduce the number of calls that you get. But there is an awareness, I think, now, if assuming you know about the TPS in the first place, people are aware that it's not going to stop the problem. So it's seen as ineffectual. Why? Because the regulators haven't used the data that the TPS has generated to take adequate enforcement action that's to deter firms from using people's numbers, even if they have registered with the TPS. Secondly, there is this confusion about when does your registration with the TPS apply? Businesses have been arguing, you have given permission to us as a third party to contact you, therefore your registration with the TPS is not
And is that
applicable.
when they may have inadvertently ticked a box somewhere?
It is. Now, the truth is, your registration with the TPS does trump third-party marketing, but businesses have been playing on that doubt, that confusion about when the TPS applies. In calls, people have told us that's what firms have been saying to them on live calls. Oh, you ticked a box, therefore your TPS registration doesn't apply. So there's been confusion about what the TPS is there to do. There's not been sufficient enough awareness of it. But then I think really importantly, the information that the TPS generates when people do go back and complain, look, I'm registered with the TPS, I'm still getting calls. When people have complained, that information hasn't been acted on adequately by regulators. So the whole thing looks rather toothless.
Because in addition, there's a very important point that a lot of the time you don't have the number of the caller. And this is something which is now rather belatedly being followed up. But there is no way that the TPS can do anything, or for that matter, that Ofcom or the ICO can do anything unless they have some notion of who the caller is.
And presumably if it's an international call, which so
and
many
if it's international,
they can't anyway. So really,
exactly.
So apart from that, the issue is around clarifying what the law actually says, and it's also about enforcement.
Yeah, the TPS is nothing more than a list of phone numbers, and firms are supposed to screen their direct marketing calls against it. If they're not keeping their TPS register up to date, if they're not screening regularly enough, if they're just simply flouting it, unless the TPS is used as a means to an end, good enforcement, it is simply a list.
Well, you'll be talking to them later on, I understand, so it'll be a much better source than we are.
Can I have
Yes,
a very quick historical understanding, which I may or may not be correct? The TPS started as a measure by the direct marketing industry
As
a measure by the direct marketing industry themselves to try and ensure that they were focusing their telemarketing energies on people who were happy to be called. Yeah? By taking the numbers of people who weren't happy to be called, the industry believed it could better focus its own activities. Along came the Privacy and Electronic Communications Directive for the EU, which required consent to direct marketing. In some member states, the decision was made to hold a register of those who did consent. The UK took the view that consent would be assumed unless people registered with the Telephone Preference Service. Now, that was some years ago. If that proposition were to be put today, that consent to receipt of unsolicited direct marketing calls be assumed unless you took the trouble to opt out, if that proposition was put today, it would be laughed away.
But would it make any difference if one was to change that? Because actually what you're saying is it's being overridden anyway.
It's being overridden anyway. If you were to reverse it, if you were to say reverse the assumption and start again, who on earth would put in any effort to trying to canvass for a register of people who wanted to be called by anybody? The whole point is this is consent across the board. It's not the very particular consent that I think many of us would be happy to grant. Many of us would say, well, I don't mind charities, but I don't want people sending me this.
And MPs, don't forget.
Maybe we won't mention MPs. I think that's been discussed. But the point is that this is a general consent. Yeah? And this is what I say, that just doesn't make sense. We can't do things on a general basis anymore. We've got to focus on, I believe, rooting out the areas where it is not appropriate by means where that can be done effectively, over and above the provisions that the ICO do.
Can I just make absolutely clear, when I fill in, when I order something online, and at the end there's a little box which says, would you like to receive further offers? Yes, no. And then it says, can we share your information with chosen preferred suppliers? If I tick that box, am I basically giving free rein for them to give my information to anybody they choose?
Yes.
It would appear so.
So that's how they're doing it. By ticking that box, I'm removing all rights I have to prevent it.
Although registering with the TPS is you opting out to receiving direct marketing calls where that data is being shared. I mean, it's worse than that, actually, because in many standard terms and conditions of contracts now, there is permission you are giving permission. For example, with some major banks, you are giving permission for your data to be shared. So this issue of for what purpose and for how long your consent is given is absolutely crucial to tackling the problem.
Can I ask you about better enforcement? And we have had one or two high-profile cases. Now, has that helped? And is it possible that we can get more enforcement into the system, and that would help more?
Which was saying 6 months ago, the enforcement is just not credible, it's not effective, and we called for a task force of the regulators, including the sectoral regulators like the claims management regulator, as David was referring to clearly set out what they were going to do to work together to tackle this. And there are problems which they've recognised about the different thresholds they have under the different regulatory frameworks they work to before they can actually take enforcement action. So that's one of our recommendations, is to lower the burden of proof required by the ICO in particular, to lower the threshold so that it can take enforcement action more easily. But they are now working together more closely. They are not allowed strictly legally to share data between the ICO and Ofcom, so there's a problem there. The willingness to take enforcement action is now much greater than it was a year ago, I'd say, and that's why we're starting to see more cases coming through the system. But this has not, in my view, been a priority for the regulators, nor has there been adequate and close enough work together to identify the strategic priorities, for example, claims management companies, and to figure out if the tools that they have to take enforcement action aren't good enough, to be clear about what they need to be able to sort this out. I think we now get into a situation where they're both working together better, and we are clearer about the flaws in the toolkit that they have to take action.
And when you do get, so, as I say, and when you do get a company, you've been able to identify it and you have the evidence, are you suggesting that they need to be really whacked hard with a large penalty?
I think they do. And part of the problem
and how big should that penalty be?
Part of the problem the ICO has, it is required to whack them with a proportionate fine, and they've then got the problem as an enforcer using their powers anew of making that fine stick. There are firms that have been hit with a fine and haven't paid yet, I understand. So there is a real issue about the credibility of the enforcement action that the ICO is able to take, as well as how much evidence it needs to be able to take that action in the first place.
David?
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing that worries me, I know it sounds good to hear about regulators working together, but I actually worry when I hear about regulators working together, because what they're doing is they're covering each other's backsides. They're slowing down their individual processes. The important thing about a regulator is a regulator has responsibilities, and by getting in close with another regulator, all one fears they may be doing is trying to shuffle this between the two of them and sort of make things a bit dodgy. We need to call individual regulators to account for doing their job, saying, oh, we have to work with them, we have to work with someone else. They should have clear duties. And if they have to try and work together with someone else, given the judicial problems about passing information between them, then I think something's going on. I've seen Ofcom and the ICO work together in the past. To a certain extent, that's positive. But I've also seen, A, things fall through the net, and secondly, the two of them have a vendetta against a certain company, and both of them go for that same company, which looks a bit dodgy.
So
now,
you're not setting any faith in you're basically saying you don't have any faith in the regulators getting together to do a proper job.
Regulators are there, they have a job to do, and they should be called to account individually for what they're doing. If they club together, that makes that much harder. And I think that's a broad point. In terms of the action taken, there are a number of actions which the Information Commissioner has taken recently. One of the most notable was against the company that many of us are familiar with from BBC Three, the company known as the call centre that BBC did. The action was taken against them. They disputed throughout the course of the work that was being done over this issue of consent that we've just been discussing. That was the basis of them, that's in the record, of the trouble that the ICO had in getting to the penalty. They have now appealed to the Information Tribunal, and that case is being considered by the Information Tribunal at present, and it will come to a hearing at some time in weeks to come. I don't know the exact timetable. It may well be that out of that hearing we will learn a lot more about how these issues around the rules about consent are judged in a legalistic way, and we may all learn a little more about that from how that particular case proceeds, about exactly where the law sits in terms of this business of consent. So that will be interesting. But again, we have this absurd situation that someone who was, as we would understand it, subject to appeal, a lawbreaker, becomes the star of a TV show and becomes celebrated for what they're doing. I mean, yes, okay, we do celebrate some charming rogues on television, but in a reality show, the Information Commission were investigating this company before the BBC series were commissioned. It's not just come to light recently.
Do you think that should be taken up with the BBC, or has it been taken up?
It is, but it's something for us to reflect on as a society, that we do celebrate these rogues,
Yes.
who we're sitting here now saying something must be done about. It's an odd thing.
Okay.
Could I throw in a few more points there? Of course, we need better enforcement, but even if we ended up with perfect enforcement of the rules we've got, that wouldn't mean that the problem would go away. Yes, I see David nodding, and I think everybody would agree that there are some calls that annoy people that actually are legal. But we're not going to get perfect enforcement for the simple reason, on top of the things that have already been mentioned, that there is a very large number of companies in this direct marketing game, and this is something that recent research by Ofcom has illustrated very clearly. They got, as you probably know, a large panel of people to keep notes over a 4-week period of all the calls they received that they didn't want and who they were from. And that showed that only a small proportion of the nuisance calls came from a small number of companies, and this has been backed up by evidence from elsewhere too. And the regulators just aren't staffed to go after this enormous long tail of small offenders.
Tracy Crouch.
Can I just follow up on that? We talk about enforcement, but actually, is it not the case that part of the problem is that nobody's willing to take responsibility for these issues in the first place, and therefore perhaps the system of regulation itself is not quite right? If I may just demonstrate with an email that I had from a constituent who had been or has been ex-directory for 10 years and started to receive silent calls throughout the day. He spoke to his ISP provider, who said they couldn't block silent calls. He spoke to TPS, who confirmed he was registered, but that they don't police silent calls and that he needed to speak to Ofcom. He spoke to Ofcom, who said they couldn't do anything about it and that he would need to change his number, which obviously he was very unwilling to do, which is when he then got in touch with me. But that does that not demonstrate that there is a problem actually with the system of regulation in the first place?
I completely
Yes.
it's complicated, it's fragmented, there are different types of problem that are under the jurisdiction of different regulators. So I completely agree with Claire and David. What we need to see is leadership and accountability here. We need to see a minister, I would suggest a DCMS minister who is responsible for this area, making sure that all the regulators with their different powers are using them to the maximum and in a coordinated way. It's not impossible. They've shown a willingness to start doing this. I think it would be difficult to completely redesign the regulatory landscape and to start attacking this problem very fast. I think there's still a long way to go before we've used the regulatory powers and joined up effectively enough with clear leadership and responsibility to use what's already on the table in an effective way. But it is a mess, it is complex, and it's partly a mess and complex because the legislative framework and the different regulations that bear on this problem are in some cases very broad. We're talking about data protection, we're talking about the powers of Ofcom, about the ICO and other regulators as well. So there's a range of different legislation that can be used to bear down on this problem. That's why I think it's too simplistic to say just give it to one regulator. Perhaps give it to one individual based in a regulator to be accountable for ensuring that all those powers are effectively brought to bear, accountable to a single minister who we know.
And let's not forget it's also something that the carriers can help with, the people who actually deliver those phone calls to you. There are technical approaches that can be applied in networks or through gadgets attached to the network, which could help in particular circumstances. And while I think Richard said very early on, and I know David would agree, that we feel it's wrong that individuals should have to go out of their way to get special treatment, and particularly to have to pay for special treatment in order to avoid a nuisance that shouldn't be there in the first place. Nonetheless, these companies do have a role to play in making the options available and making them more easily available and cheaper or free to people who need them.
Exactly the issue we're coming on to next with Jim Sheridan. Just before I call Jim, David, you wanted to...
I was going to say very quickly to explain the situation of Tracy's constituents. If that call had been made, although silent, if it had been made with a direct marketing purpose, and to someone who was registered with the TPS, even though the call wasn't completed, if there had been a direct marketing purpose behind it, strictly speaking, it would have been a breach of the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations. However, the ICO, from an enforcement point of view, takes a policy position that says, unless the caller declares their direct marketing purpose in the course of the call, we cannot treat it as though they had a direct marketing purpose. Now that raises all sorts of other questions. But because of that, if it's a silent call, they obviously can't do anything about it because nobody said anything. For that reason, the issue of dealing with calls that end in silence passed over at the time when the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations were brought in. Ofcom had what's called the persistent misuse powers, which are a sort of fallback power for dealing with things that aren't caught by any other regulation, which previously had been the responsibility of the telephone companies, but then other EU rules said you can't make telephone companies tell people how to use the telephone. So Ofcom picked up the persistent misuse powers as a sort of fallback for any bad behaviour using the telephone. Then somebody realised that this enormous problem of silent calls nobody was going to do anything about. And somebody had the brilliant idea, why couldn't Ofcom use these powers that it's got to sweep up the problem of silent calls? Well, the point is, those aren't powers of regulation, because Ofcom cannot impose regulation on a general basis on users of telephone systems. Ofcom is regulator of the providers of telephone services, not the users. But Ofcom tried to do its best, pretending that it's got regulatory powers, and it used a statement of policy to lay out what it thought were regulations about silent calls. However, it did so in a proportionate way, which has ended us up in the absurd situation with Ofcom trying to be proportionate in its regulation, where it effectively tolerates a situation whereby any company can end 3% of the calls they make in silence and be compliant with Ofcom's suggested guidance, which is why over the last 3 years Ofcom has had 60,000 complaints about silent calls and has used its powers against not one company. Do we assume every one of the cases it investigated it found they were within the 3% limit? That's Ofcom's answer.
They're coming next week. We'll ask them. Jim Sheridan.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just go back to the question of data? One of the tabloid newspapers recently ran a headline saying that people's data was being sold for £5, including telephone numbers, etc. Is there any sort of tangible evidence that is the case? Do we know of any?
I haven't done any work on that. We are pretty sure it happens, and if somebody wanted to follow it, I'm sure that wouldn't be difficult. It's not something we've done. I don't know, Richard. I mean, you're big on this now.
There's a market for so-called lead generation, and there are companies who you can pay to give you, you can go online and find them very easily, who you can pay to give you warm leads for marketing purposes.
But that's without the person's permission.
The means, well, it may be or it may not be, but the means by which they do that is by using the personal data that you have given at some point in the past. So this goes to this question of whether consent was given or not, or whether people were clear about their giving the consent to being contacted for direct marketing purposes in the past. So, yeah, there is a big and growing market in personal data. It's very easy for a business to commission a company to make cold calls or emails or texts to people and to find out whether they want your services. The question about the responsibility of the commissioner of that service to ensure that compliance with data protection rules and the PECA regulations have been made, we think is too weak. So if the ICO, say, wants to go to a company to ensure that when it's outsourced that lead generation work, that it's checking that lead generation company is compliant, it's too loose, it's too vague, there isn't enough enforcement action. And again, this goes back to what David was talking about, to cut off the problem at its source. If firms that are outsourcing that lead generation work were in fear of regulatory action if they themselves weren't ensuring compliance in a much more rigorous way than often people are, then that would help reduce the number of cold calls that are coming in.
An interesting way of getting to the bottom of this might be to ask the companies who run price comparison and switching websites how they fund their business.
Yeah,
it is widely believed that that's how those websites are funded.
See, my own sort of personal experience when in a former life when I worked for a living, and you would come off night shift, for instance, and halfway through your daytime or your nighttime, you get telephone calls from people wanting to sell you insurance, etc. And it's even more annoying when you think that companies are getting paid to do that and waking people up in the middle of the night. So we can understand the frustration and the anger. And is there anything that the telecoms companies, I mean, given all the new technology that's out there just now, is there anything that telecom companies can do to trace the originators of the calls?
We think there is a lot more that the telecoms companies themselves could do. One, in ensuring that there is an easier mechanism for people to report a call. So why can't I dial, hash 2020 and for that to register with my telecoms provider that I've just had an unwanted call, and that then is a further piece of evidence, further information for them on unsolicited calls. We would like, there are already handsets that are out there now, we've been testing them and some of them are quite effective to screen calls. But again, why should I have to buy a £150 handset to screen unsolicited calls from my telecom provider? Why cannot they do more? And they are starting to talk now about doing more to identify in their networks when there is very large volumes of calls being generated by businesses that we know through the screening, through the complaints to the TPS and to Ofcom and the ICO, may be being done by firms that are making nuisance calls. So there are things that are being done a bit, but a lot of it is to do again with the burden on the consumer rather than the burden being on the provider, to help people to screen out calls, to make reporting much easier, and to get the technology in place. For example, with mobile phones, the technology does exist to have the equivalent of spam filters, so you could have spam text screened out. Why can't the mobile providers offer that to customers at a very low or no cost in the same way that email providers do?
I mean, just on the telecom companies, what more or what less they can do as well. If I just digress slightly, there is a big problem, and perhaps we come under the heading of nuisance calls, and that is our emergency services are called out as false alarms. Is there any way the telecoms companies can trace those telephone calls to make sure that our emergency services aren't overstretched.
Yeah, one important point to remember is that in the telephone networks, so we've got BT and later they'll probably confirm this, in the telephone networks there is the capacity to trace every call. If it's important enough, it will be traced. As I understand it, every call to a 999 is
there a
automatically
problem
logged
with
and traced.
Voice over Internet Protocol? I was told Voice over Internet Protocol was quite difficult to trace.
I'm not an expert. There may well be issues and qualifiers, but insofar as it's within the network, which of course VoIP takes it outside, but obviously remember VoIP has got to have a portal into the back into the network again. That may not identify the individual caller, but at least you've got somewhere.
They can identify the individual number.
That can be done in any case. I mean, the capability is there. The question is how ready the telephone companies are, based on the technology they have, to deploy this technology for you and I just getting a call that we don't particularly want at any time of day. I have at times in the past taken advantage, and thanks to BT for this, of having a particular call tracing facility in place, whereby if I want the true identity of anybody who called me on the most recent call to be logged, I key in a particular number. I then check with the Nuisance Call Bureau. They say, yes, that was logged. And then we're in a position to take further action if we need to. That facility is made available by BT, but only on a very selective basis. I'm happy to mention that it's available because BT do have to ration it. What exactly the technical implications are and why it needs to be rationed in that way and why it couldn't be switched on for everybody at every time is something which I'm sure BT will be able to give you a good answer on. Because if we have this, the issue of using caller line identification, which is a quite separate thing, and there are cases where that does need to be withheld, using that as a means of tracing nuisance, we could set aside. Yeah, I'm not happy about the idea of using caller line identification, which has other purposes, simply as a means of tracing nuisance callers. It may be helpful in that regard, and I wouldn't dispute that. But if we try to put all the focus on CLI as being purely for the purpose of catching nuisance callers, then that's going to create all sorts of other difficulties, which we might wish to avoid.
Could I ask just a very quick question about charities? A number of charities depend on cold calling, nuisance calls. Has there been any impact assessment carried out, the effect of any legislation would have on funding for charities?
I know there has been. I'm trying to remember. There was some work done a little while ago about the problem because, of course, the TPS, people who register with the TPS, cut off charities from calling them unless they have in some way registered with that charity. I'm sure some work was done. I can't remember where, but I'm sure that somebody from that sector would be keen to make a point. Which is where my point comes saying we need to look at this on a sector by sector basis.
If I could pick up, I'm very glad you mentioned impact assessment. You've heard the three of us mentioning quite a large number of things which could or should or maybe ought to be done, and I'm sure as you go through the other witnesses you're going to hear today and next week you're going to hear a lot of other things, and basically what you end up with is a very confused picture, and what we don't have, to the best of my knowledge, is an overall study which looks coolly and objectively and using the best available evidence at what the impact of any one of these measures might be or what they might be in combination. And that would be a very good start, to have a decent study using all the expertise that is available in the industry, seeing where people agree. A lot of it is, I'm afraid, going to be suck it and see, but what we need is an enlightened leadership that is going to identify some of these actions that are most likely to have a useful effect. Keep watch, see what the effects are, and measure what's going on, see if we can get a real useful reduction in the nuisance.
Of course, charities have to comply with the Data Protection Act, and it's in no good businesses or charities' interest to be bombarding people with nuisance calls. That's why some of the measures that are being proposed would be a burden on the good players who are going to comply with it and not deal with the miscreants who flout the existing rules. So I think for a charity whose management is concerned about their reputation, they're not going to flout the Data Protection Act, they're not going to be bombarding people with nuisance calls and texts. The vast majority of this is done by businesses for whom the existing regulations are disregarded.
Paul Farrelly?
It's only my two youngest who actually bother to answer the landline these days, because the rest of us just assume every call's a nuisance call. And I suppose it's only inertia that or vague thoughts of having it for an emergency that we don't get rid of the landline. I'm sure lots of people don't get rid of it because they don't realise that they don't need a voice telephone to have broadband. So that's something for the telecoms providers in terms of how it affects their business. But thankfully, my mobile has not been affected in 20 years, and I don't want anyone to affect it after this session. Thank you. But one of my assistants has just replaced the mobile because of too many spam calls. Claire, you said it's on its way to mobiles. What's driving that? Is that reducing costs of completion? Availability of numbers? What's driving it?
Yes, reducing costs of completion, I believe. But again, as I said, there are other people probably in the room right now, and certainly who you'll talk to in the course of this inquiry, who'll be able to give you better and fuller information on that than I can. But beware.
I mean, it may be that the reducing number of people who have landlines or who answer them to know people in the committee, maybe they bought everything that the call have got to sell, this diminishing number of people for whom, of course, what happens is that as the list gets shorter, the poor whatsits are still left answering these calls, get more and more and more. It may well be that when they're not there, the callers will give up and they won't bother to move to mobiles. I don't think so. One has to assume if there's a market there. I mean, the cost of calling a mobile isn't a significant issue. I mean, we had this wonderful case of this chap, Lee Beaumont, who some of you may have heard about in the media last week, who got himself an 0871 premium rate number, because he was getting fed up of PPI calls in particular. And he thought, well, that will stop them because they won't want to call that. Well, in fact, it turned out the other way around. He used this number, put it on these comparison websites, and before too long, he was getting loads of calls from PPI companies on this 0871 number. But then realising he made 7p a minute on every incoming call, he thought, hey, this isn't such a bad idea. So when these people phoned up, rather than being a nuisance, he's obviously got time to spend chatting to them. He said, well, I'll just chat to them and I'll make money out of it. It was a lovely story. It's a great story. Obviously, it's not a practical answer for most people. But one thing that does demonstrate is that even the cost of calling an 0871 number, which is far more the cost of calling mobile, as far as an originator is concerned, doesn't put these people off calling. I believe that most of their expense in setting up their operation and in buying the list, paying the £5 to get the list of people to call, I think that's where most of the cost is. I don't think the cost of actually making the telephone call, because telephony is now incredibly cheap, generally. I don't believe the cost of making the call is a significant issue as far as they're concerned. So I see no reason why they won't move on to mobiles.
Okay. I think we probably need to move on to our next session. So thank you, all three of you, very much. For our next session, we're going to look particularly at the